This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'll be taking a look at Iroshizuku Fuyu-gaki. I'll test it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub, and I'm going to start with the Extra Fine nib in the Pilot 78G, let's see, this is G+. I'm writing on Tomoe River paper. No scratchiness. Feels pretty good for an extra fine. So I'm going to label this nice. Next, I've got a Pilot Prera with a fine nib. Not a noticeable difference in smoothness, no scratchiness, but not a noticeable difference between the fine and the extra fine. But it is just a nice, pleasant writing experience. If you write with extra fine and fine nibs, you'll know there's going to be, just by the nature of the fineness of the nib, there's going to be a certain amount of feedback. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 74 with a 14 karat fine nib. Now, I would say, look how much wetter that is. I would say that the steel fine nib felt smoother than the gold fine nib. The gold fine nib didn't feel scratchy, but there was almost like a grippiness on the paper. This 14 karat fine nib is softer. It's got a little bit of bounce to it, and I don't know, it almost feels like, if you would compare using a stylus on a glass screen, a plastic stylus, compare it to a rubber tip stylus. The rubber tip stylus isn't rough, it's just there's a grippiness. That's almost what this gold nib feels like. Alright, next I've got a Kaweco Perkeo with a medium nib. Very smooth. Pretty wet, and not glassy smooth. Like, I can hear the sound of the nib on the paper, just the slightest bit of friction between the paper and the nib, just enough to give you some control of the nib. I like it. Alright, next I've got a Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. Now, normally with this cursive medium nib, it's a little bit drier. Well, let's see. See, it's a little bit drier than the previous two nibs. And with the ink being spread out over a wider area, usually it's a little bit lighter. But I've noticed that this Fuyu-gaki is just a nice flat ink. There's not much shading to it. Really, there's not hardly any shading to it. It's just a nice flat ink. All right, next I've got a Nemesign Singularity with a 0.6 stub nib. And usually there's a big difference in the darkness of the ink between the Pilot Metropolitan and the Nemesign, but I'm not really seeing a difference here. And that's just another demonstration of the evenness of the color of this ink. All right, and finally I've got a Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. All right. And while that dries, I'm going to take a look at a few other writing samples that I've done on other papers. In my little art notebook, you can see how even each of these writing samples look. The 78G extra fine was nice. In fact, this ink, look at the little X's. See the difference between the Tomoe River paper, where it doesn't soak into the paper immediately, and the Arc notebook paper. As I was writing with this, the ink would just soak straight into the paper. The ink would spread, and that's an unpleasant experience when you're writing with fountain pens. Usually you want to see that ink float on top of the paper just a little bit. It's a more enjoyable experience. So with this ink that soaked in so quickly, the finer nibs were more enjoyable, and the Pilot Metropolitan that's just naturally a little bit drier. With those types of nibs, you didn't have as much ink spread, and even though the ink spread out, it didn't tend to feather. It just spread pretty uniformly. Let's see. The 1.5 stub was really the only one that tried to bleed through. It didn't bleed through too badly, but not bad. So it just sinks into that top layer and spreads out. It doesn't do too bad soaking all the way through the paper. Now, on my Rhodia writing sample, normally you would see some shading here, especially in the wider nibs, but look how uniform that is. The Nemesign, there's not a lot of difference between the Nemesign and the Pilot Metropolitan. So I really liked this one in my Pilot Metropolitan. It was very smooth and pleasant to write with, and it looks good. That was on Rhodia paper. And on my 20-pound copy paper, since it soaks in so quickly, I put little sad faces beside the Custom 74 and the medium, because both of these put down a decent amount of ink. Wet nibs with this ink on really absorbent papers are just not pleasant because it just soaks in so quickly and spreads out. Again, it didn't tend to feather, but you can see that the ink soaked in and just really spread out. So really, the extra fine was the most pleasant writing experience. And they all really tended to bleed through at least a little bit, even the extra fine. In my Rhodia notebook, it's just a nice, vibrant orange. Very uniform. No shading, no sheen, but a pretty color. And finally, on the Rhodia paper, no sheen. I'm seeing just the slightest hint of shading. Now, I think my Nemesign, I was running out of ink a little bit, but even though I was running out of ink, there's a little bit of shading there. It's pretty flat. My Perkeo, there's a little bit of shading. That Perkeo medium is a pen that tends to show off shading in inks that are prone to that. So on Tomoe River, I'm seeing just little hints of shading in some of those wider nibs. I like the Metropolitan. There is some subtle shading there that gives the writing a little character. Now, I got this ink when I was looking for a replacement for KWZ Standard Grapefruit, which is a red-orange. I love that ink, but KWZ inks come in such large bottles, and I use fine nibs. I don't go through ink very quickly, and I love these little 15 ml bottles of Iroshizuku. That's the perfect size for me. So just going by what the ink looked like, comparing it on pictures on the internet, I thought, well, this looks pretty close. It's a reddish orange. Comparing it to Fuyu-gaki, looked like it had a lot of red in it. But it's mostly orange. And I'm going to be doing a comparison video of the orange inks in the future. And so there you'll be able to see how this ink compares to Fuyu-gaki and KWZ Standard Grapefruit. Well, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.